Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I just first and foremost, I'm Alice Julier. I am the director of the Food Studies program at Chatham and also of CRAFT, which is the Center for Regional Agriculture, Food and Transformation, a tiny but amazing powerhouse of regional food system love. And I really want to acknowledge and appreciate everyone who's here on Zoom and in person, especially this time of year, especially during all sorts of different kinds of things, from Ramadan to the end of the semester to everything that goes on in our lives. And so we are at the Eden Hall campus of Chatham University, which the current occupant of that space is the Falk School of Sustainability and the Environment. And this space we're on, we're its most recent stewards after different indigenous groups, including the Lenape, some Scottish-Irish colonialists, Sebastian and Elizabeth Hines Mueller and their families who worked this land agriculturally, the women factory workers who spent time here outside the smoke and toil of the industrial city that we live in. And in our time, the women students and faculty of Chatham College prior to its current iteration as an all-gender place of higher education. And so just to give us a context of where we are and who we are. This event is an outgrowth of a bunch of conversations and work done most directly over the last 4 years at the Association for the Study of Food and Society, or ASFS as we fondly know it. It's conference, it's journal, and conversations usually over a meal or standing outside at a farm, seeing what people are doing. And it was driven, in this particular case, by the scholarship of Dr. Abby Wilkerson, who organized the panels that we've done, but was unable to join us today. And I think Abby and I talked about this a lot, and we see this day just as like a partial incursion into the questions of food and disabilities and justice. And I hope that she and other people can join us next year. That is, this is just a beginning space for us. I don't think there's any way to represent the range of options and possibilities that we have out there to talk about the way that food, embodiment, disability, and justice come together. And I want to position it and say that the work that everyone is doing, that they're going to talk about today, this morning, represents kind of both intellectual and material incursions into different spaces, but that the conversations about how food and disability come together and how justice functions in that space, how we think about it through that lens, is something we're just beginning to talk about in this particular conversation. And I have a lot of hope for where we're going to go with it over time. And so I want to invite you back to the next iterations. Those of you that are here in person, I want to invite you to a lunch after this at our bread oven. And then this afternoon, we'll have some open-ended conversations and some interaction around like brainstorming and thinking out and sort of really kind of naming ourselves in space and thinking about like, how do we do this work? What do people need in that space and in this time, whether it's research or policy or programs or anything, right? All open to it. So that said, I'm deeply honored to have all these folks here, friends, colleagues, old and new. And so we're going to start and allow each person to introduce themselves, but Dana Ferrante will go first, and then Farah Turnakar, and then John Deutsch, and then Carrie Tippin. And I'll allow them to situate themselves and talk about what they're doing. And then afterwards, if there's time, we can start a conversation and answer questions with people here and online. And then hopefully those of us that are here can move the conversation to the bread oven. So thank you, and thanks for being here.
Cool, thanks.
Okay.
Will it show up when I? Cool. Okay, so before I get started, I'd really like to thank Alice and Abby, who is not here today, for inviting me to present today. It's really an honor to be here and convene in person and virtually. For those who don't know me, I'm Dana, she, her. I'm a master's student in gastronomy at BU. I am graduating in May, finally. And I'm here today to talk about my master's thesis research. Okay. So before diving into the research, I want to first ground us in the words of disability justice activist Leah Lakshmi Piexna Samarasina. In her 2018 book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, Leah describes the power in asserting that disabled people could know things that the able-bodied don't, a body of knowledge she terms CRIP skills or CRIP science. The idea that CRIP skills exist contradicts, as she writes, the deficiency model by which most people view disability or disabled people as a lack, a defect, a damaged good in need of cure. And she continues, the idea that we have cultures, skills, science, and technology runs counter to all of that in a big way. Naming that also means having to field some able-bodied blank stares. Able-bodied people are shameless about really not getting it that disabled people could know things that the able don't, that there might be something that they could learn from us, end quote. Her book's really great, I would recommend it. So Leah's words highlight an important overarching premise of my research, that disabled foodways not only exist, but contain critical and distinct insights into food. So Alice has touched on that. That's something that people in food studies are already exploring, but the discipline as a whole sort of continues to overlook it. Leah's words also provide an opportunity for me to reflect on my own positionality in conducting this research. As a non-disabled white woman and a graduate student, I'm an outside interpreter of participants' experiences, and I acknowledge how my own identities affect the conclusions that I'll draw here today. Okay. So my research asks, how do disabled people relate to and engage in procuring food, cooking, and eating? To investigate this question, I conducted semi-structured interviews with self-identified disabled people living in the greater Boston area. There's a lot of text, it's okay, I'm just gonna speed through so we can get to the fun part. So beyond the typical methodological considerations of an ethnographic study, flexibility, accessibility, and confidentiality were important parts of my research design. One example is that I let participants choose which method of interview would be most accessible to them. That was especially important any day, but also given the ongoing threat of COVID-19. In terms of confidentiality, each person you'll hear about today was assigned a pseudonym, and any personally identifiable information, so like their job title, where they work, that sort of thing, was removed from the transcripts. This was required by the IRB and the type of protocol that I had to submit, but it was also a way for participants, to encourage participants to speak openly without potentially subjecting themselves to stigma or a loss of independence. Finally, those interviews were recorded, transcribed, and coded. So again, I've decided to devote most of today to my findings, so I'm happy to discuss any theory, methodologies, sort of questions that come up. Okay, so there are many theories and definitions of disability. In my study, folks were eligible to participate if they claimed disability as an identity. So this is a really important difference between this study and something, and research that uses, for example, like the CDC's definition of disability, where a disabled person is somebody who reports a functional limitation in one of 6 areas, right? So I didn't ask people for any sort of medical anything. It's really important to note. So beyond disability as an identity, my study is grounded in disability studies, and thus approaches disability as a social process. So it's not a static category or an individual medical issue or defect. but a concept that is socially, culturally, politically, and relationally constructed. At the same time, it also recognizes disability as a lived and felt embodied experience and perspective. And it also acknowledges how environments, ideas, tools, that sort of thing can disable or enable certain people. Okay, another slide we're going to fly through. Obviously, people have worked on this before. So these are some of the theories and models I use, also some of the literature on food and disability that was super influential, but I'm just gonna speed right along. So the participant sample. So the findings I'm sharing today are based on 16 interviews that I conducted, interviews I conducted with 16 disabled people from March to September 2022. To give you an idea of who participated, it was a cross-disability group, not exactly, but it was relatively diverse in terms of disability and impairment. There's a list on the slide to give you an idea, but just in general, I interviewed folks who were physically disabled, visually disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, etc. The majority of folks were white, so 13 out of 16 identified fully or in part as white. The sample was quite diverse in terms of gender and sexuality. Almost half the participants identified as queer, and the majority were women. Finally, the majority of folks worked or studied full-time. So as you might have already suspected, this is not a representative sample of disabled people in the greater Boston area, Massachusetts, the US. There's a lot of limitations and reasons, but two huge ones are that Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people do have a higher rate of disability compared to white populations. And again, my sample was majority white. Finally, it's not representative of the disabled population in terms of their education level, their participation in the labor force, and food security. So I didn't measure food security insecurity, but this is just my supposition based on what folks told me. And then to give you more insight into that, out of everyone, 3 participants weren't working at the time and were receiving different types of benefits, and then only 1 person mentioned using SNAP during the interview, which is not representative. Okay, getting towards the fun part. We have one more slide to get through. So despite these limitations, this research still provides important insights into the foodways of disabled people. So after analyzing those transcripts for emergent themes, I concluded that disabled foodways are mediated through dynamic body-minds, interdependent relationships, and agentic adaptation in ableist sociocultural and physical environments. The human translation to that sentence, which is my thesis, is that disabled people who participated in the study are expert planners, expert adapters who develop strategies to navigate inaccessible shopping environments, to cook according to their embodied needs and preferences, and to make sure that they can access food when they're in pain, or fatigued or physically unable to shop or cook. So when faced with dining and furthermore, when faced with dining situations that were physically or socially inaccessible, I'm gonna slow down. They turn to trusted others or those who respect their autonomy and agency for support. So today I divided my findings into 3 categories: procuring food, cooking, and eating. And in each of those categories, I'm gonna talk about the story of 1 participant and then sort of summarize a few other related stories. Okay, so in general, study participants found the grocery store to be a disabling environment. Nevertheless, they emerged as highly adaptable, developing ways to navigate the inaccessible environment and ableist expectations around food shopping, often enlisting the help of trusted others to do so. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to Rebecca. Rebecca is visually impaired. She's a white woman in her late 30s, and she lives with her husband. In her own words, Rebecca hates the grocery store and, quote, avoids it like the plague. For Rebecca, who has fibromyalgia and chronic migraines, the bright lights and the unpredictable noise of the grocery store often causes sensory overload. Because grocery stores are designed for sighted people, so both the aisle markers and any of the nutrition information is conveyed visually, Rebecca finds it difficult to locate the exact items on her list. So beyond limiting her choices, this also impacts her well-being since she does manage her chronic migraines and fibromyalgia by avoiding a lot of commonly found ingredients. So she's got to pretty much get the exact things that she needs. Before she met her husband, Rebecca preferred to coordinate her trips to the grocery store with a family member or friend, someone who she could trust to get the exact items on her list. She had tried to rely on grocery store staff, but found their help unreliable at best. She'd end up purchasing items she couldn't eat, or they make her feel like, quote, an inconvenience. So, under the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, grocery stores are considered public accommodations. They must make reasonable modifications to accommodate a person with a disability. So like blind folks and visually impaired folks like Rebecca do have the right to ask for assistance in locating items in the store. But as her story highlights, this system isn't reliable and often introduces socio-emotional barriers to the experience. So today, Rebecca can now more readily procure the foods that she needs as she trusts her husband, who Rebecca says enjoys grocery shopping. She told this funny story about how she found out that about him while they were dating, and she was like, I'm never letting this man go. She was very funny. So she can trust him to get the exact items on her list. And so this relationship of interdependence or mutual dependence with her husband enables Rebecca to make decisions about what she eats without having to face both a physically and socio-emotionally inaccessible environment. In contrast to Rebecca, 2 other visually impaired women in the study sung the praises of online grocery shopping, which they could do from their personal mobile devices. This process enabled their autonomy as they could listen to the items in their shopping cart using Siri, or they could even change the font size of ingredients lists, unlike physical cereal box. Other participants highlighted the grocery store as an environment designed for ambulatory people or people who can walk, and they pointed out the ways in which accommodations often fail to provide full access. One example is Dawn. She has trouble walking or standing for long periods of time, so she uses the motorized sit-down grocery carts. If you guys know, okay. She called it the ridey cart. So she shops with the store's provided carts, and though this helps her navigate the store, she says that she still has to bring her teenage daughters along because she can't reach everything that she'd like to buy, and the stores do not allow you to ride the carts into the parking lot, so how is she supposed to load her groceries into the car? So overall, I found that participants develop strategies to obtain food in ways that account for their diverse embodiments, maintain their ability to make choices, and enlist the help of trusted others when needed. Okay, moving on to cooking. So in our society, there's this idea that there are right and wrong ways to cook. These ideas are often grounded in whiteness. They're also grounded in this ableist assumption that only some body minds are capable of good cooking. In reality, how people cook, what tools they use, whether they really cook at all, is the result of a complex web of interactions among a person's body mind, their cooking knowledge, their food preferences, identities, and more. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to Van. Van, whose pronouns are Zer, is white, non-binary, lives with her husband, and has more than a decade of experience in food service. Van also has long COVID. So like other study participants who experience chronic pain, fatigue, migraines, or depression, Van has adapted many of their cooking techniques to save energy. So Van sits on their couch as much as possible while cooking and paces herself while chopping vegetables, for example. Van also often uses a multi-cooker, so like an Instant Pot sort of thing, so Z doesn't have to stand constantly while cooking. So given Van's career in food service, I was really curious whether Z was able to use similar cooking approaches at work. I'm sure you guys have worked in food service. If you're sitting down, even if you're doing your job and sitting down, they accuse you of being a slacker. So I was really curious about this. But Van said Z is lucky to work in a physically accessible and supportive environment where Z can work according to their embodied needs. So the store that Van works in is ADA compliant, meaning that there are ramps instead of stairs, enabling Van to push heavy items such as milk crates around the store instead of carrying them. Z has also created a seated workstation for herself, meaning Z can complete slicing and chopping tasks without having to stand. Because Van had worked at this company for almost a decade before getting long COVID, Van is very close with many of their coworkers. If Van is having a low energy day, Z feels comfortable asking for a task Z can complete while seated. And Van told me, and this is a quote, "It was very difficult at first to ask for help with certain things. And like nobody ever gave me shit. And then people just started knowing the things I was probably going to ask for. There's a lot of interdependency at work." Overall, Van said Z did not have to contend with ableism at work. Van attributed this to the fact that their coworkers, many of whom are queer like Van, were no strangers to discrimination. As such, the store had cultivated an open, queer-friendly, accepting environment in which Van feels comfortable advocating for herself, both as a non-binary person and a multiply disabled person. So, despite this sociocultural norm that explicitly or implicitly holds standing as the correct position to cook in, Van and other participants' stories highlight the fact that one does not need to stand to be a skilled home cook or a valued employee. Okay, so one other cooking approach I want to highlight is this concept of emergency food. Rory used this term to describe their practice of always stocking their pantry with bulk food items or easy-to-heat frozen meals, anticipating that there would be times in which they were physically unable to cook. And so pretty much anybody who was chronically ill or those who, like Rory, experienced severe depression all had their own approach to emergency food. Some purchased reheatable frozen meals when they could afford them, or others did the meal prep themselves. Other strategies to deal with high pain days included having a family member, partner, or roommate cook or help cook dinner. Takeout was another. The last one is like having like this go-to easy recipe that they know that they can consistently do without using too much energy. So as you might have noticed from these examples, the strategies that participants developed to navigate these times were highly contingent on a person's preferences, embodied needs, living situation, financial situation, relationships with others, and more. Okay, last one is eating. So as we know, food studies does an excellent job of approaching food both as a socio-cultural object and something that is eaten, something that is embodied, but largely the field has overlooked how disability or ableism may impact a person's experience of eating. So in this final section, I'm going to specifically focus on participants' experiences of eating with others or in public. So I guess I would call it like social eating. Okay. When it comes to eating with others or in public, participants, especially those with eating disorders or complex dietary needs, emphasize that eating safely, and that's the term that Rebecca used. So eating safely was not just about what food options were available during a shared meal, but the social environment and relationships they had with the other diners present. In other words, eating socially was an interdependent act, one that could be enabled or disabled by the actions and attitudes of fellow diners. So to stay full, satiated, and present at like larger occasions, like something like a wedding or even like a conference, participants did have strategies such as eating before the event or packing a snack or bringing an actual meal to the event. If they were attending like an informal gathering or a potluck, they always brought something that they knew that they could eat. But their stories really made clear that their full participation and access to an event in many ways hinged on whether other diners honored those choices surrounding food. So did their fellow eaters ask a bunch of intrusive questions about their food choices? Did they discount their credibility and like the validity of their needs? Or were the other diners supportive, cultivating an environment in which the participant could eat safely and also enjoy the party? Okay, so as my last spotlight, I'm going to introduce you to Lisa. Lisa is a visually impaired woman who has a service dog. She's also queer, white, and a self-described fat chick. She's very funny too. I can't convey how funny some people were. She used this term, fat chick, while describing her experience eating out in public. And this is a quote from her. "As a fat chick who did not start out as a fat chick, I am aware that eating in public is a thing, right? I like donuts. I want to go somewhere and get myself a donut. Then, if I'm sitting there in the place, I'm a fat chick eating a donut. So Lisa's comments underscore how fat phobia, ableism, disableism, and pity sort of combine to make Lisa into a spectacle when she's eating a stereotypically fattening food in public. People may stare at her, find her disgusting, pitiable, or perhaps worse, assume that she doesn't know any better. Let's see. Furthermore, given that she navigates public spaces with a service dog, Lisa's disability identity, which is quite visible, right, because of the service dog, also impacts whether she'll be let into that donut shop in the first place. So Lisa told me, and this is another quote, "There are places I don't go to because they've given me a hard time about the guide dog." So again, though the ADA protects a person's right to enter an establishment with a service dog, Lisa can never be sure whether she'll be welcome. On the whole, Lisa's experiences eating in public as a disabled fat chick underscored the need to approach disabled foodways from an intersectional lens. So to buy breakfast, Lisa needs not only money, but for others to respect her rights and bodily autonomy. So for a more fuller, nuanced understanding of eating as both an embodied and sociocultural act, we need to better account for the stories, experiences, and insights of disabled people in our scholarship. I have a couple more slides. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty close to 20 minutes, but if it's okay to keep going. Okay. So my degree is in food studies, so most of my conclusions in my thesis are, largely speak to that and why we need to take disability and ableism more seriously in food studies. So like the other scholars before me, I argue that we need more research on disabled foodways that centers disabled people's agency, as well as more research on how ableism shapes relationships with food. Drawing on the scholarship of Kim Q. Hall and Abby Wilkerson, my thesis challenges food studies' normative understanding of embodiment as it relates to food. So in Hall's terms, it reveals how good bodies and good food are contingent. They're interactively emergent concepts. And then per Wilkerson, it challenges us to recognize variation and vulnerabilities within and among body minds as the norm. Yes. Finally, as those scholars have also written, my research makes the case for using interdependence as a way to examine or understand foodways, their meanings, and how they came to be. And then my last slide is about future directions, I guess. One of the hardest parts of this project for me was learning all this stuff and wanting to tell people immediately, get other people fired up about this stuff, but having to finish the thesis so I could graduate, I guess. So I'm excited to graduate and have more time to pursue those things that I guess I had to leave behind. So first goal for me, obviously this presentation has been super text heavy. It's not very accessible. So sort of thinking through ways that I can present this information in different multimedia formats and that sort of thing. I've also amassed a lot of non-scholarly articles that I think would be, or basically writing, so journalism, or even the disability justice writings that speak to food that I think need to be paired with the scholarship that exists. So I'm hoping to make a sort of open source bibliography to put it all in one place. And then another thing that I've been sort of mulling over is how to convey some of the things that folks told me or some of their concerns to food industry and food service professionals. Yeah, that's a big question that I have. And then finally, I would really like to continue this research in some form. I think that having a co-partner or a co-organization or something folks who are already working in the community would be a really valuable way to continue it, and then also make sure the research has more direct, immediate benefits. And these are all my sources. There's actually more. I had to squeeze them all in, and I'm done. Thank you.
Do you want to sit sweater because I'm cold?
Yeah, do you want to sit there? and
Oh,
have
I
me do your
would
slides,
love
or you?
I would rather.
I know.
But are my slides downloaded because I sent them to you?
I got you.
You got me.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I can also do it for you if you want to sit.
Oh, sure then. Okay.
I can also do it too. I'm already here, Alice.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay,
you just
then-
have to cue whoever
Yeah,
it is.
okay.
That's fine. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
I know.
Okay. So Oh,
your
right.
mic.
So I should introduce myself? Yes, okay. Okay. So my name is Farah Turniger. I'm a professor of sociology and the director of general studies at Lemoyne College, which is in Syracuse. And this is a very preliminary talk that I'm giving about research that I really just began in December, right? And so I kind of want to start out by talking a little bit about, that. So I think we can go to the second slide. So it's part of a larger book manuscript. This is my second manuscript that hopes to look at food more deeply. My first project, Intersectionality in South Asian Muslim American Women, used food as one of 3 modes of analysis, but this next manuscript really wants to center both food, but also feminist food studies and intersectional feminist food studies, and I want to unpack that a little bit. My work is really, it is very much informed by food studies, but it has really centers intersectional feminist food studies, and I'll talk a little bit about how I understand that. And I use the word, my work is grounded in feminisms, because I really want to acknowledge that I was trained by second and third wave feminists, but my work has really evolved into this conversation between intersectional and transnational feminists. And also my positionality as a feminist scholar is I really insert myself in my work now, which I didn't do previously. I was trained as a sociologist. And so kind of still using sociological methods, but really, really grounding this work in feminism and claiming autoethnography is a new method for me. And so I kind of want to unpack my positionality first, because I think that's really important in doing this work, right? So not only I'm a woman of color, I'm Indian, I'm Muslim, I benefit from heterosexist privilege, able-bodied privilege, but I'm also an insider-outsider in the work that I do, right? So I'm intentionally actually studying a community that I was raised in. So my work is qualitative autoethnography within the Indian Muslim community, which is part of a multiracial Muslim community in Tampa, Florida, of all places, right? So Florida, right? And so, I just think that's really important, because when I'm telling the story, these stories and these narratives, there are times where I am reluctant to share, because I'm talking about issues of marginalized women, but also issues around thinking about ethics, and as a qualitative researcher who was doing autoethnography, also wanting to protect the women that I talk about and making sure that I accurately represent them. So that's like a big chunk of what I struggle with as a feminist scholar in this new way that I'm trying to do research, and thinking about the women that I'm interviewing, talking to, having conversations with as my co-researchers, because I'm also questioning the way that we create knowledge, and really thinking about feminist epistemology, right? This idea, who are we, because we have PhDs creating knowledge, right? And how are the community members, participants, and our scholarship also creating knowledge. And so I really hope to kind of shift the way that we think about that and intersectional feminist food studies by engaging with disability studies, by engaging with fat studies, by engaging with anti-racism in the work that I do, So that's important in terms of how I'm kind of going forward in this work. Okay, I think the next slide. Okay, so I usually don't even do PowerPoint, so I'm like looking up there, and then I have this paper also written out, So I think it's, when I'm talking about intersectional feminist food studies, I think it's also really important that I trace the work, back to intersectionality, thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw, in the late 80s and early 90s, and where sociologists like Patricia Hill Collins, and later really important black feminist Jennifer Nash, and others have done with this work. But in terms of coming to this from food studies, my work is largely influenced also thinking about disability studies, Abby Wilkerson, thinking about intersectionality, Psyche Forson-Smith, Alice Julier, and then also thinking about when I'm studying Muslim Indian widows, right? So I'm thinking about eating alone and eating together, right? So Alice's work actually really, when I started thinking about eating together and the importance of commensality and the sociality of eating together, I thought about that so much in terms of thinking about marginalized women, widows, and immigrant women. But then I also, Anita Manour's new work, Eating Alone. You know, what does it mean to eat alone, in public especially? And then if you're racialized, or you're not able-bodied, or you're perceived as fat, then what, you know, how does that add that extra layer? So these, you know, so the work of Abby Wilkerson, Psyche Forson-Smith, Alice Julier, Anita Manour have also shaped the new project that I'm looking at as well. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, okay, so what am I really trying to say here? So I'm interested in culinary placemaking, invisible disabilities, and widowhood, okay? So what I'm interested in, and who I don't even want to say I'm interviewing them, because I'm really using Meredith Abarca's methodology, right? Culinaria Charlas, you know, these chats that she has. And so I'm also building on her in terms of my methodology, right? So how am I collecting this data? Sorry, Charlas Culinarias. You know, culinary chats, when Meredith Abarca was working on, and she still does, works on Mexican women in Texas, right? The way that she did her research was having conversations with Mexican women, right? Not necessarily like doing this kind of sociological, I don't mean to be so critical of my own discipline, but like sitting people down one at a time and saying, I'm going to interview you for 60 minutes, right? But actually having conversations with people in your own community. And that kind of insider-outsider research, I think, is really valuable when you're talking about things like immigration, racism, and in my conversations, Islamophobia, these kinds of things. But then also, I'm talking about widowhood. That is not easy to talk about, right? Many of us actually have family members that are widows, and that can even be triggering. So using her methods to talk about widowhood, I think, is really important, right? Because you're in conversation, you're not an interviewer, right? And so I really thought a lot about that in terms of methodology, you know. So I'm interested in how culinary placemaking actually changes, because widowhood, right? Widows are at a higher risk of invisible disability, right? And so what I'm looking at is, in terms of thinking about disability justice, is in the research on culinary placemaking and food studies, there is some research looking specifically at widows. There is some that's coming out of some different disciplines, right? And so I think, you know, I want to recognize that. It's not that nobody has looked at widowhood and disabilities, specifically thinking about what happens when you have this loss of a spouse, right? There's been some research done by Sidney Anderson, who writes, with the loss of a spouse, everyday commensal routines can be disrupted or discontinued. This may challenge both the rhythm and organization of daily life, and it can be the first step of many impacting negatively on the widow's or widower's health status. Entering new commensal circles could offer a remedy here, right? Eating together can help, right, navigate some of the chronic depression, PTSD, and severe anxiety that widows or widowers have, right? So eating together helps forge new social relationships through sharing meals, and that's actually part of a way that we can think of an intervention, right? So what I'm interested in is this idea that even though there has been some research on widowhood and foodways, right? It's largely not been looking at racialized women, immigrant women, and I found no research on Muslim women, right? And so that area is really under research, right? And so what I want to kind of look at and unpack using an intersectional feminist lens is thinking about race, class, gender. My previous manuscript added religion to this intersectional feminist foodways framework, but then also thinking about disability justice, right? And thinking about, you know, some of the work that Abby Wilkerson has done, as well as there's been a lot of other work in terms of thinking about widowhood and invisible disability, but then also understanding that when we think about invisible disabilities, they often lead to visible disabilities, right? So thinking about mental and psychological health as well as physical health. And so I'm trying to, and as I said, this is very early in this research, so I'm trying to look at all of these key aspects together. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I talked a little bit already about the fact that this is an exploratory study, right? And I'm building on this idea of eating alone and eating together, and how, how does that shift happens, right? And so when I think about that shift, 3 key themes in my preliminary research have already come up in terms of eating together and eating alone, right? So I'm studying a circle of friends that are widows, that are Muslim Indian widows in Tampa, Florida, okay? And each of them have lost their heterosexual, Indian, Muslim, middle-class women living in Tampa. They've lost their husbands at different ages. So the youngest lost her husband in her 30s of a heart attack. The most recent, who's now 80, who lost her husband during COVID, right? And so these conversations, for some of them are reflecting on being a widow for more than 30 years, others widowed recently. So I think that's first important. So I've started to have in-depth conversations with 2 of the widows that I'm talking to, and so so very much I'm thinking about these conversations as part of life histories in terms of thinking about, I'm not calling them really interviews. I'm thinking of them as like conversations around life histories, right? And so in terms of talking to 2 of the widows so far, right, but also because I'm an outsider in this community, I know all 5 of them, so I actually know when they were widowed, and I know I was around when eating practices changed over the last 20 years. So one of the first key themes in terms of thinking about methods and research and what has already emerged is the first year of widowhood for Muslim Indian women can actually be comforting in some ways, though they're dealing with loss and grief, because community comes, right? So like even when we think about white middle-class widowhood, if you are part of a community, there are food trains, right? So for Muslim Indian widows in this community, there's usually a food train that lasts for the first 30 to 40 days, because the widows don't leave the house for the first 30 days, So those first 30 to 40 days, the food trains are there, which means not only food is coming in the house, but you're not eating alone if you don't want to, right? Someone is entering your house. No one drops food at the doorstep. Everyone comes inside to greet and spend time with the widow. And so that's like a key important theme, that those first couple of months, people come, people give you food, people give you homemade food, right? So there's homemade food, there's fresh food, and there's also eating together, right? And so what's interesting, though, is after those first couple of months, widows talk about not wanting to cook, however, because they don't want to cook for just themselves, right? Cooking for one is a challenge because these women that I'm interviewing, these are Muslim Indian women who are now all ages 75 to 85, right? So they're from an Indian generation where women are socialized to cook for their families, and then if they don't have children at home anymore or their husbands are not there, they don't want to cook. So they talk about this, right? A second interesting theme, and I think it kind of connects to some of the things that Dana was talking about, is what is good food, and when they start to eat and for themselves, what are they consuming, okay? And so, what is good food and what is good cooking, And I want to think, and that's where I'm thinking like a sociologist, and what is the social construction of what is good food and what is good cooking, right? Because one of the patterns that came up is after that first year, when they're like, okay, I'm going to leave the house alone, maybe I want to get something to eat, they went to fast food, right? And there's so much judgment on eating fast food, especially in white middle-class communities. I would actually argue there's less judgment in immigrant communities about that, right? So one of the widows talked specifically about going to Wendy's regularly, right? And I think what's interesting about that is she also spoke about, she's like, I'm going to Wendy's. That's not junk food. I can get a salad, right? I can get a chili. And so a second widow spoke specifically about going to Taco Bell twice a week, right? But Taco Bell, because I can eat vegetarian, because I maintain halal, right? So eating halal and maintaining halal food practices also comes up in these conversations with Muslim Indian widows, right? And so the theme of fast food and eating fast food regularly, when I first heard this, I was a little bit like, I raised middle class, and I'm also in food studies as much as I'm in women's studies, But then when I thought about, well, the judgment we have on people that eat fast food more than once a week, but then also this idea that they're not just getting the fast food they talked about because it's easy and they don't have to cook, but they don't have to eat alone. You go through a drive-through. And one of them talks specifically about, well, if I go through a drive-through twice a week at Taco Bell, I can get food that is quick, it could be vegetarian, I don't have to worry about eating halal, and I don't have to eat alone. Right? I can take it home, right? So this idea of not being ready to eat in public alone for Muslim widows. And I also should say, this is a circle of 5 women, and 2 of them wear hijab, all 5 of them maintain modesty norms. So I think that's all, so maintaining halal practices, maintaining modesty practices, and thinking about eating alone in public, I think it's all important as well, right? The third thing that emerged in the research so far is after 5 to 7 years of widowhood, they start to more openly talk about having high levels of depression, right? And so I think, also going back to what Dana said, I didn't ask any of them, and I'm not asking any of them, like, are you medically diagnosed? I'm thinking about how they perceive their own status, and knowing that, in my methods, I do talk a little bit about how different organizations, right, categorize invisible disability, right, and so thinking about depression and anxiety and PTSD, but in these conversations, how it comes up when they're talking about depression, and how there's the initial grief that widows feel in that first 1 to 3 years, but then there's also waves that can come back after 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, right? And so one widow specifically has been widowed for 20 years, and she's talking about how since COVID, she has been triggered because not only living alone, but living alone during COVID, right? And so this is a woman who is 73 years old. English is not her first language. She doesn't have these food apps, right? Because sometimes her daughter would say, why don't you just order Olive Garden through your app? Don't keep getting Taco Bell, right? Or why don't you just order Wegmans or Whole Foods through your app, right? But so there's that other level of like being an immigrant woman who has lived in this country for 50 years, but COVID was, another theme that when you're living alone and then you're on lockdown, even in Florida, okay, where they didn't necessarily, we're on the same page as the rest of the country, and your children are telling you not to leave the house, how does, depression and anxiety, how is that like increased during COVID when you're living alone and you're a widow and you're also not tech savvy and ordering your own groceries or ordering, Wendy's or Olive Garden or whatever food you want through an app. And I think and so for me, when I thought about that, because I always, I had always thought, if you live alone, you can at least just use your app and order food. But if you have these other challenges, that's not so easy, right? So it really made me question how I had always thought about disability, how I had always thought about access to food, good food, and also the issue of cooking, right? Like good women are supposed to cook, especially Indian women, right? And how much cooking is like tied to identity. And I also thought that was important, and I also thought that was interesting. And connected to that, like eating out in public, one of the women did talk about how since she was widowed, she gained a lot of weight, okay? And she talked about that, and she said, yes, people perceive me now as fat, And I also go back to Anna Mallow's work in fat studies and disability studies. And she said, well, I'm old now, and so I don't care if people think I'm fat, but I am afraid about my mobility, right? So that idea about invisible disabilities connecting to physical disabilities. And so I thought that was really interesting, because these women talk about how they don't want to get remarried, because that's not common in their community. So it's not, and so they talk about, I don't really care as much what I look like anymore. So maybe people think I'm fat, but that's not what concerns me, but can I get around? Will I be able to buy my own groceries? When will I be able to cook for my grandchildren, And so ultimately, I started to see these patterns and these conversations around food, but I have to say it's often difficult to generalize about how invisible disabilities might materialize into physical disabilities, specifically when I'm talking about racialized, marginalized widows, right? I'm talking about a very specific, very specific group of women. And I want to recognize that. And then my own challenges as an insider, outsider within this community and sharing information that might be very sensitive, might be very personal, you know. So I continue to grapple with that too. So then I go back to my theoretical framework. I guess we can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you, right? And thinking about, you know, this intersectional feminist analysis is necessary, right? So, you know, I came to intersectionality through Kimberly Crenshaw, thinking about race, class, and gender. In my previous work, I added religion when I was studying halal foodways. When I'm talking to these widows, I'm thinking about immigration status, but I'm still thinking about how ability needs to be part of this analysis, right? We need to ask why, and in particular, when we're studying widows, we're studying the aging population. You know, I would say, you know, and many other populations, invisible disabilities as well needs to be really integrated, not just added on, right? And I feel like this is one of the things that Psyche Forsen Smith always tells me, we're not just adding on another variable, right? Let's add one more, right? Where we're really thinking about how do these become like interlocking modes of oppression. And I think the next slide, maybe. Okay, so I talked already a little bit about methods, right? But one of the things I also grapple with is when I'm doing community research within a community that I'm part of, and I no longer live there, but I'm doing community research within a community that I was actually raised in, right? So the ethics around talking about sensitive issues around loss and around widowhood, you know, and that's something that I actually think is like a continuing conversation that I hope to have, you know, later today. And also, even when we're talking about invisible disabilities and depression and anxiety and PTSD. I think the next slide. Okay, so what do I hope to actually think about here in terms of this discussion, right? So I highlighted these three themes already, right? The community support that widows have initially, the theme of fast food, you know, how can we like unpack that in terms of thinking about eating alone, questioning what we think about as good food, and then also negotiating disabilities and culinary placemaking. And that's kind of like what I want to talk about now. So, you know, the title of my talk, you know, I went back and forth thinking about eating alone, right? Because my larger book manuscript is on biryani, and this biryani is like a symbol for like Indian Muslims, right? And this idea of eating alone, what does it mean when you eat biryani alone, right? Well, biryani is like the lasagna. You don't make a pan of biryani for one person, right? So when I say biryani for one, maybe some of us when we were in college or are in college or grad school made lasagna for one, right? But that's where I think about culinary placemaking, right? Because food is a way that communities develop solidarity, right? And especially when we look at the history of immigration in the United States, right? Look at the early Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and now Arab, Muslim, Indian, you know, Chinese, Japanese, you know, continuing ways of immigrants, right? Food plays an important part in this. And so culinary placemaking is central to the question in terms of thinking about widows, right? Because when you're talking about marginalized, racialized widows that struggle with invisible disabilities, if they don't have a larger community, and commensality is so important in terms of mental health, you know, I feel like this is where disability justice is an important intervention, you know. And I think, okay, so I feel like I talked about a lot of, you know, different things, and I'd rather have more of a conversation later. And I know when I was writing this up, I'm like, maybe this is 15 minutes because this is a work in progress, you know. But in conclusion, this project really asks for a more intersectional and transnational feminist framework in the future of food studies. If my work is going to stay in food studies, right? If the discipline intends to be more inclusive and challenge some of the hegemonic ways of scholarship, truly intersectional and transnational feminist foodways calls for a change not only in theoretical frameworks, but in knowledge making, right? And that's why I talk about feminist epistemology. Hierarchies, including race, gender, ability, heteronormativity, right? And boundaries continue to shape not only how we create knowledge, but also academia, right? Both inside and outside academia and food studies, right? And I am optimistic, especially when I meet young disability justice activists like Dana. My work also has been influenced by a very young scholar in Syracuse, Laura Jaffe. So these new, I feel, disability justice activists can teach us how to create a more inclusive but also accessible space, and taking a closer look at how ableism shapes eating together or eating alone is just one place where we might begin this work.
All right. I'll plug in. Yep.
I don't know where yours are, sorry.
No, mine's on the left.
Okay.
Crunchy wrapping.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Does the PTSD come from the loss of their spouse?
Other
factors in it?
Well, for some of them it's different, right? And so, for some of them it comes from the loss, because the one woman who lost it in her 30s, she suffered from PTSD.
get over there.
The second woman, 20 years later, she is getting triggered by something during COVID, right? And so that's why I'm like not even really ready to generalize about the community that I'm talking about. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for that question,
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I want to say a couple things. Number one, thank you for talking about disability as like just not another variable. I actually have a disability. I'm autistic, so I'm really appreciative of that. And like as you were talking about widowhood, like I was also thinking of my mom. She's not a widow, but she's recently divorced. And thinking about it's a lot of the same thing.
No. Agreed. I looked at some of the literature that compares widowhood to divorce, and divorce has an immense loss, and the loss that, the way that society treats, especially depending on the community that you're in when you go through a divorce or a widow, you become a widow. And so.
And just thinking about how my mom loves to cook so it's just my mom, my sister, and I left. Basically, we had to move out of my old house kind of forcefully, and so the three of us live together. It's been hard since I've been away, and but she loves to. Whenever I come home, she's always like, "I want to cook you something," because like cooking was such a source of joy that
Yes.
the bad marriage took away from her, and I think like she's slowly gaining that joy back. So.
Yeah, and I think, and I feel like in the research that's linked to depression and anxiety, right? For both, I think, divorced women who their identity was tied to cooking, as well as widowed women, right? And I haven't even started to talk as much about like this idea when these women are saying, well, food is love, and my husband is no longer here, so I don't want to cook. But when my grandchildren come home, for some, or children come home, right?
She actually associates, I think, the love less with her husband, with my father and more with us.
Yes, that makes sense.
My
Yeah.
father was pretty rotten.
No.
She did not associate any love with him.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Divorce is different. That's where divorce and widowhood, I definitely think it's different. Yeah. No, I mean, when I started going down the rabbit hole of research on widowhood, which I never thought I would do, like this is brand new. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there, for sure. No.
I know Murakami just left, but Dr. Murakami has also made it very accessible to talk about like those identities. He like includes it. He's the guy who was sitting there.
Oh, okay.
He like talks about it and includes it, and I feel like that like it's such an important part of my life. Like my mom was kind of the only parent I got, really, in a sense. So I know, long story, but just attributing that cooking. She loves teaching me. She's always like, here, let's do it this way, and so like just thinking about her a lot when you're talking about that, because I can see her in your when you're talking about that, I see her.
Right.
And she's not a young woman anymore. She's like in her 50s.
Us too. Us too. Thanks, Allie.
No. I was gonna say I really appreciate your comments. I wok forward to talk to you even more, like one-on-one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, John.
Thanks so much. And thanks to Alice and Abby for having me. I'm really, I think this all flows in interesting and disconnected ways. I'm not a disability scholar, I'm a cook, and so I'm hopeful that this conversation and some of the work we're doing can be informed by collaboration, and I'd love to see it a little bit more out in the world, but for now it's more of a kind of case study in what we're doing on the ground. So a little bit about our work and our research. I'm John Deutsch, I should introduce myself. I'm at Drexel University. I'm a professor of culinary arts and science. I'm the director of the Food Innovation and Entrepreneurship Programs, which is a new little subsection that we can talk about more. And I direct the Drexel Food Lab, which is sort of our practicum site for food innovation and entrepreneurship. Drexel is a strange place for many reasons, one of which is we're a Carnegie R1 doctoral granting research university with a culinary arts degree, and we weren't quite sure ever what to do with that, and so this lab is sort of an example, and hopefully you'll see that in action. So we do this translational research, applying culinary arts and science to improve the health of people, planet, and economies through consumer research, product development, and commercialization. And our principles are do good, feed well, keep going, which means do good means all of our projects have some sort of social benefit. Feed well means we're into food and not kind of functional ingredients and nutraceuticals, and we want to prioritize taste. And keep going means we're not a policy people or trying to advocate for different, to get the food into people's mouths in different ways. We're trying to build sort of market solutions where people want to eat this stuff because it's delicious and not because they're told to or it comes in their assistance or whatever. And we always emphasize that our real product has nothing to do with food. It has to do with talent and future of our industry. And the idea is that if we can get, so I'll take this tangent because of where I am. There's a bunch of programs in higher ed that focus on creating complicit cogs to work in the dysfunctional food industry, programs like food science, maybe nutrition, depending on your perspective, culinary arts, agribusiness, all those kinds of things. And then maybe there's a little bit of time to think critically, but mostly you're learning how to do things like food product development. Then there are programs like yours where people are taught to be very critical and skeptical of a lot of things, and programs like public health, maybe some of nutrition, rural sociology, alternative agriculture, sustainability are all, tend to be on that side. And so what we're hoping to do is teach the technical skills that all the other food science and culinary programs do, but with that critical lens so that students are applying the best decades of their career to these problems and not having some kind of realization when they're no longer young that they should have dedicated their career to something more useful. So that's the idea. So, and then our students go out into the world and populate with good food work is the hope. And the other thing I'll emphasize is that our students are not 18-year-olds in chef hats. They're doctors and dietitians and undergrad through postdoc. And we do this work from nothing, and we do sort of targeted work. I'm just going to skip a bunch of stuff. And we do this for startups through multinationals as well as nonprofits, government agencies, and so on. So all of that was fine. And then we met our most adorable food lab client ever, whose name is Fiona. And her mother came to us, and because Fiona was nonverbal at the time, couldn't come to us, and probably also would have needed parental guidance on how to contact a university with a food product development problem, and asked for some assistance. So I'll talk about the work we did and then kind of where it's going. So Fiona, at this time, the time of this picture, was 4. Unlike IRB sanctioned research, I have, this is not a pseudonym. I have permission from Fiona's mom, who's a public health epidemiologist and chair of the Ontario Autism Council, to tell the story because she wants the story told. Fiona at the time was 4, nonverbal, child with autism. There are many terms, as you've heard, like autism spectrum disorder, with people with autism, autistic people. I try to honor the terms that are used when they come to us, so you'll see different terms in the literature, but Fiona's mom identifies Fiona as a child with autism, so I will use that as best I remember. There's a story about why Fiona came to us, which was not initially for food product development, but sort of for nutrition guidance. So this is Fiona's lunch tray, and you can see it's very compartmentalized. Like many children with autism, Fiona doesn't like foods touching, so everything has to be separate. And it's not a very good picture, but I'll take you through it. Also like many children with autism, Fiona is selective, what we call picky, and what the literature calls selective, because you can't say picky and be an academic. If you look at, this is the interactive portion of the talk. If you look at Fiona's tray, you'll see those veggie straws, which are neither veggies nor straws. Right? This is the product that we developed that I'll talk about, and that's why it was sent to us by her teacher, because she wanted to show us that she's actually eating what we developed. These are apple slices. These are carrots and celery, which you'll see are anew combined in the same compartment, so that's a good step. And these are blueberries, which was an unsuccessful. So forgetting the blueberries, we have veggie straws, we have apples, and we have carrot and celery sticks. What do you notice about that as a lunch, putting your kind of nutrition and food and sensory hat? No protein. Yeah, and what do these foods have in common?
The shape, maybe sticks.
Sticks, yeah.
Crunchy.
Crunchy. Yeah, so selective eating is very common among people with autism, but it's idiosyncratic what that means. Could be color, could be other things. In this case, it's crunchy. So Fiona doesn't like crunchy foods, which is on its surface like fine, okay. I don't like raw tomatoes. Okay in life, right? But the problem is if you think about protein, beans, meat, tofu, cheese, peanut butter, none of it is crunchy, right? The reason that Fiona's mother reached out was because she was eating from the dog kibble. And initially, they thought it was a behavioral. When I was 4, I pretended to be a dog too. My name was Peter, and I did similar things. I ate out of the dog bowl and ran around on the floor. But after changing the dog's feeding schedule to accommodate this behavior, Fiona still wanted the dog food. And they realized that it was not about the dog food, it was about the protein, right? It was a very, talk about like it was an expert survival strategy that really kept Fiona from needing tube feeding, or because she also won't drink oral nutrition supplements like Ensure and Boost, and so on. So they realized that there was a problem with the protein. And that's I'm going to really breeze through this part because it's the literature. But basically, there's no standard definition of picky eating, but it's basically people who consume an inadequate variety of foods. And for many children in particular, it's a phase, right? And so if it's sort of not a concern for most kids because it's a phase and then they stop being in that phase. But for some kids, it could turn into what is now in the DSM as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. And it can cause problems, right? Weight loss, nutritional deficiency, dependence on oral nutrition supplements like Pediasure, reliance on enteral feeding, which is tube feeding, which is really horrible if you don't need it. And then obviously social problems, right? And these problems, the incidence of ARFID, are exacerbated among people with autism, particularly children with autism and teens. And so, you see it manifest in decreased dietary intakes, especially vegetables. Could be this paradox where they're actually eating more of calorie-dense foods. And then some talk about low zinc and iron because those are found in non-processed meats. And then vitamin and mineral deficiencies that can cause things that most of us don't ever think about, like scurvy. So these are the literature recommended. This is sort of the predominant article on ways to treat selective eating. And if you look at these, I'll give you another interactive question. What do all of these strategies have in common? Yeah, they're all behavioral interventions. None of them have anything to do with food. And so they're all like, something's wrong with you, here's how we're gonna fix you with this behavioral intervention. And then if it's unsuccessful, you might need oral supplementation, such as tube feeding or oral nutrition supplements. All right, so this brings us back to Fiona. So what we did was not a behavioral intervention, because you can imagine that her family tried just about all of these strategies and to no avail. And it was getting to the point where she would need some tube feeding or other solution. And we developed a solution that would fit into our client's lifestyle, right? Which is, you like crunchy dog food type kibble, we can make you a human, appropriate socially, protein rich, fat rich, which fat is good. Some people criticize that, but it's actually a good thing. It's a macronutrient, it's natural. So anyway, a protein rich, fat rich, and actually this is upcycled, this was in the infancy of some of the upcycled food stuff we've been working on and that's been happening, because it uses defatted sunflower protein, which is the pomace after they make sunflower seed oil. It's very fiber rich and protein rich and nutty. And it gives it that kind of brown kibble color, which I don't know if that's important or not, but it works. And I'll show you we'll theorize in a little bit, but this is some videos of Fiona picking these up at the post office.
Oh, open please. Are you excited? Say thank you. Yay! So happy.
And this is Fiona eating them.
Crunchy? Crunchy. Say thank you, friend. I love these. So happy.
So you get the idea. I always say if all of our clients could be as enthusiastic about our cooking as Fiona, it would be great. And this is just her. They put out a bunch of food. I'll just show you.
Do you like the bites?
So they put out like different crunchy things to see what she'd be interested in.
Num num.
And then she outsmarted everyone, and you'll see that in a minute.
What are you looking for? No. No.
So she just went for like the bag of them, which I thought was great. So to get a little academic. So what we're trying to do is kind of reverse how food product development works. So usually it starts with a market opportunity. What's on the market? Where's what the marketers call white space? And then they develop something to fit that market need. And then they try to encourage people to buy that, right? And then the idea, if you talk to a nutritionist or a dietitian or a doctor, it's all about navigating what's out there, right? It's here's your specific condition or situation, and we heard this in Dana's work too, right? And in Farah's work. Here's the world and how it works, and here's your situation, and you have to adjust yourself because you're too fat, or you're kosher, or you know whatever's wrong with you, you have to fit into this world, right, and figure out for yourself how to navigate that world. And then you hurt yourself doing that through things like diabetes and heart disease and all the problems. And then all those people I mentioned earlier try to undo that, right, through medical interventions and drugs and telling you to undo all the damage you did. And then the food industry makes some additional products to help you with that, right? Like a reduced sugar version or a reduced salt version or so on. So this is where we are now. And so what we're trying to do is kind of meet people where they are and say, well, why don't you just tell us what we can do preventatively and we can just develop it for the marketplace. And that would be a lot more efficient than trying to navigate this marketplace and undo the marketplace. So that's the idea here. And then just to conclude, so we're doing this now there's a couple things happening. One is this bite, this snack turns out to resonate. One of the most popular foods among kids in general and among kids with autism in particular are Pepperidge Farm goldfish. And so we got a lot of feedback from docs that they want something like goldfish that has protein and fat, good fat. And so we have essentially a new version of this that's a little bit more goldfish-like. So that's being slowly but surely, hopefully, commercialized. And then the other thing we've been doing is working more with groups to teach them how to make these, but also to teach them other kind of food things. And so this is a group of teenagers from the Philly School District with autism who are part of a program called Cooking with Confidence. And we're a little bit not critical, I'll take that back. They have a lovely program. And what they're doing is teaching kids life skills, which is very important about how to cook. And it's a lot of like, here's an easy dinner you can make at home when you're alone or with your family and so on. And that's all lovely. And it's taught by a parent who's also a chef. And it's very wonderful. But nowhere in the curriculum was there any selective eating content, right? And so if you look at the literature on kids in general and food, and every article in that domain says gardening with kids gets them to try more vegetables and be more open-minded with food, right? Cooking with kids gets them more engaged in the process, makes them more willing to try new foods. So, but there was none of that. It was all about like essential life skills. So we added this component to not necessarily target, but incorporate selective eating and try to broaden what's happening in the classroom. And some of the strategies we've used are really giving the teens agency, because teenagers want to be independent, all teenagers. And so doing a lot of things like summer rolls, where if you want to put chicken nuggets in your summer roll and that's all you are willing to do today, that's okay. But you now have the agency to try a little bit of tofu and a little bit of carrot, and maybe they're touching and maybe they're not touching, and maybe you put a layer of something in between, right? So that became really interesting. Another one we did find is soft textures are unnerving. So turning soft into other textures like chewy has been interesting, so that they can be a little bit like Oh yeah, just because it starts out soft doesn't mean it's going to end that way. So one of the great successes has been anything like dumplings or fried dumplings or pierogies, where pierogies are a great example because everything's mush, right? When you start a pierogi, and then you cook it and it gets chewy, and then you fry it and it becomes just like, especially if there's cheese inside, this like blissful, crunchy thing. And so talking about like texture is not something you have to like suffer through. You can make things to the texture you want, and you can also see that like texture has potentiality to do other things. And so people were then kind of became more accepting of softer textures through understanding that soft can become crispy and crispy can become soggy. It's the circle of life. So anyway, there's some recipes in the QR. And then we're working with NIH and the Drexel Autism Institute and the Free Library to, we have a publication hopefully coming out soon. So thank you. I will stop there.
All right, I'll be the last one. I don't have any slides, so I'll stay here if that's okay. I'm Carrie Tippin. I am a little different from these folks in that instead of talking to humans, I talk to books. I'm an English professor, and so my areas are American literature, specifically the US South, and so the ways that I kind of bring food studies and that literature studies together is through the texts of food. So most of my publications are about cookbooks and the US South. So what I'm going to talk about today comes from my newest book that just completed the manuscript. I have to put my glasses on. And it should be forthcoming in the next year or so. But through the process of this book, I started in 2019. I wrote down the outline of this book that included a chapter that would be about fat and illness and Southern food and how those things work together. I did not know that in the process of writing this book that I would first be diagnosed as pre-diabetic and then like all the way diabetic and then have to learn how to live with these things while writing a chapter about books that are about diabetic food. So my therapist really helped me through it. I'm gonna be okay. I don't know about my body, but like I think my brain is all right. So I have titled this part of it Fried Chicken and Fatback, Fatness, Illness, and Southern Food. So my newest book project examines the tension between the demands of the cookbook genre to focus on pleasure and the story of the South as a place of pain. And that's sort of like bottom line, pain and pleasure in these cookbooks. So cookbook writers take a wide variety of positions on pleasure or pain in the management of weight or disease symptoms. As they negotiate these conventions of the cookbook genre to deliver pleasure, they have to make decisions about how they're going to frame the problem, quote, of fat and illness without alienating their audience. So I really approached these cookbooks as rhetorical. I'm looking at their persuasive tactics and how that relates with audience and speaker and audience. Anyway, writers have a choice about how they're going to present the pains of being fat and the pleasures of a changing body size, or the pains of being sick and the pleasures of being well. How they decide to encode the values of those states of health or body composition really tell us kind of about their body politics. So the stereotypes of Southern food as fattening and unhealthy, think your fried chicken, your biscuits, your sweet desserts, your fried vegetables in every form, all my favorite things, creates the stereotype of fat and unhealthy Southerners. My favorite version of this is Kristen Wiig's Paula Deen caricature on Saturday Night Live. Have you seen this? So she comes out in like this padded suit and the big gray wig, and she's like, "Hey y'all, I'm Paula Deen, and and my two favorite ingredients are butter and all, butter and all." So in the sketch, Wig, as Dean, is selling this 8-ply paper towel that will suck the fat out of your good old Southern food. And so she takes this cat head biscuit out of the oven, puts it on the paper towel, and then eats butter directly out of a dish. And then the biscuit becomes like an oyster cracker after all that stuff has been sucked out of it. And then she eats it and she's like, it tastes like fucking shit. So that's the joke. The underside of that joke is that Dean herself was diagnosed as diabetic in 2009. And this caricature is 2010, but we actually find out about her diabetes in 2012. And that's just a year after she released Paula Deen's Southern Cooking Bible. So an article from CBS News released the same day of this announcement that she has this diagnosis and that she was working with the diabetes drug maker Novo Nordisk. Has the headline, Paula Deen's type 2 diabetes, is her cooking to blame? The connection between Southern food and Southern sickness, especially Southern fat, is clear in the criticism that Deen received for selling sugary and fatty food while being diabetic. The doctor that was cited in this article, who was not involved in Deen's care, said, quote, she shouldn't lose her charm, but she needs to lose her weight. And, quote, diabetes could strike anybody, but it's much less likely to strike someone active and skinny. So Deen defended her actions by explaining that she's cooking special occasion food for entertainment. This is not everyday food, she says. Quote, people have to be responsible for their own health and decisions about what they eat. So even though the author of this article never directly answers that question, the implication is clear that Deen got sick because she was fat, and she got fat because she cooked and ate Southern food. Then there's this wide body of medical scholarship about the dire sickness of Southerners, usually linked to rural poverty and extraction industries, with poor nutrition flowing from food insecurity. Appalachia is especially a target for pieces like this, with researchers claiming that diabetes and heart disease rates in Appalachia are dramatically higher than anywhere else in the U.S. Another study claiming that North Carolina is consistently one of the most food insecure states in the country, ranking 10th highest in 2018. The studies in each of these articles kind of begins with the hypothesis that the South or Appalachia is unique in its experience of disease and illness because it's also unique in its economic and cultural landscape. The story is that the South is especially poor, which is often but not uniformly credited to the persistence of racism or homophobia, the exploitive labor practices of bad businesses. So therefore, the South is especially malnourished, either by pervasive food insecurity, or as another researcher puts it, the so-called paradox of plenty, where the poor and low-paid have too much of the wrong kinds of foods. And he's especially talking about fried chicken and sugary dipping sauces, which are also my favorite. Because the South is especially badly fed, it's a region of especially sick and fat people in need of investigation and unique intervention, according to this literature. The health and wellness discourse obviously emphasizes the duty to discipline the body and the appetites, painting those who have non-normative bodies as moral failures. So at the same time, we have kind of these contrasting poles. We have, being fat is a moral failure, and then also like a body and fat positivity discourse that's kind of reclaiming the fat body as a political rebellion. And so we've got these two opposite ends of a spectrum. One marked as a painful failure of self-control, the other as a victorious pleasure over this external oppression, and in between is like the whole cookbook industry. So there's a lot of space to think about how a writer is going to focus on pleasure or pain in the middle of this conversation. In addition, the writers of the cookbooks that I looked at for this book also have to deal with the story of that unique suffering South, this diet-related illness, and a uniquely pleasurable food culture. So I've got pain, I've got pleasure, I've got fat, I've got weight loss, I've got like all these things pulling in tension. And that's sort of the rhetorical model, right? Is that as these ideas pull in tension, each writer has to find where they want to land in those tensions. So in the book, I examine cookbooks that self-identify as representing a distinctly Southern cuisine as compatible with the goals of weight loss and symptoms control, contrary to the stereotype that the Southern cuisine produces those negative health outcomes. So one of the key assumptions in these books is that Southern food is or can be healthy. The chapter focuses on how they make that argument for both Southern authenticity that gets supported with evidence and anecdote, as well as the implications of their logic on how fat bodies and people with chronic illnesses are represented as moral beings, but also as authentic Southerners. So one compelling argument is that a reader can restrict their eating, whether that means restricting calories or eliminating components like meat or dairy or carbohydrates or gluten, without separating themselves from the cultural practices of their regional identity. So in fact, according to the logic of the argument, dieting is not only compatible with performing Southern identity, but the most authentic version of Southern foodways is synonymous with health. So not only can I be authentic, but if I don't, I'm not. You right? Okay. It almost goes without saying in food study circles that eating is a social and cultural activity. So restricting your individual eating in a social setting necessitates being separated from the group. My students love this essay by Philip Vanini about his immigration from U.S. to Italy, or so Italy to the U.S., and coming to understand American snacking rituals. So he writes about how snacking occasions, like your campfires and your baseball games and movies, these are places where you would eat a thing that you wouldn't normally eat otherwise. And that's part of a high-stakes social drama, he says, that are carefully scripted and enacted before a vigilant audience who demand respect toward the profound moral and aesthetic significance of the role played by food in everyday life. So to eat differently at a communal table is to stand painfully out and apart from that community. And what's the first thing to go when you go on a diet? Salty snacks, sweet and salty snacks. So exactly the kinds that Vanini describes. So because eating is an important community ritual and exclusion is painful, the overarching goal of these diet cookbooks is to promise audiences not only the pleasures of the body, but also the pleasures of belonging in community. In this case, this imagined community of, quote, real Southerners. So in order to accomplish this rhetorical goal of pleasure, cookbook writers lean on those arguments of authenticity, convincing readers that they can have it all, the pleasure of eating in community and the pleasure of weight loss or symptom management. But diet cookbooks don't just need to sell the South, they also need to sell restriction and limitation as pleasurable experience. That sounds hard. Southern authenticity is just one layer of that pleasure. Diet cookbook writers emphasize both the physical pleasures of relief from symptoms of illness, increased energy and weight loss, and the emotional pleasures of living a longer, happier, more confident life as a result of restrictive eating. So all the books in this sample, in the chapter that I wrote, argue that restrictive eating is as delicious and satisfying as unrestricted eating, meaning that readers can continue to experience the pleasures of the palate. But most importantly, as I've already demonstrated, diet cookbooks promise that readers can continue to feel that pleasure of community, to feel normal while they're restricting their eating. These are not particularly surprising or novel promises for anybody who's familiar with diet culture or diet-related food writing. However, the potential harm becomes evident when I state the logical inverse of those promised pleasures. So if the most authentic version of Southern cuisine and character is comparable with weight loss and health, then readers aren't real Southerners if they stay fat or sick. If the community acceptance, energy, happiness, and confidence are the results of weight loss and health, then readers can't be happy if they are fat or sick. If restrictive eating is as delicious and satisfying as unrestricted eating, then being fat or sick is an illogical and perhaps immoral decision that a reader has made. And this may, go with me on this one. Only really the last item to me stands out as potentially useful for subverting these harmful stereotypes. And that's that promise that restrictive eating could be delicious. One response, of course, is to blame fat people and sick people for not making the effort to change their diet sooner. But another underlying assumption of the argument is that all people, regardless of size or diagnosis, want and deserve foods that are bodily nourishing, palate-pleasing, and culturally appropriate. So those kind of three things together seem to be a place where we could do something good. So the chapter concludes with examples of how writers deploy the pleasure of eating as a persuasive technique and how they might call into question these other assumptions about fat and illness in the ways that they use persuasion. So with just a little time left, I'm going to describe kind of the big picture of the study. I did a survey of cookbooks from about 2000 to the present with the self-identified Southern connection. So I like it when they have South in the title. That helps me a lot. And I sort of created 3 categories. One category is kind of general healthy cooking cookbooks. So they don't have at their center kind of an appeal to weight loss or to any particular disease or illness, but a kind of a representation of a healthy food that maybe has less sugar or fat or salt, but still these kind of canonical Southern foods. This would be something like the Lee Brothers' Simple Fresh Southern from 2009, Paula Deen Cuts the Fat from 2015, Eric and Shanna Jones' 22 book, Healthier Southern Cooking, along with a whole bunch of vegan and vegetarian cookbooks that promise to keep Southern authenticity without any of the meat, like Jenny Claiborne's Sweet Potato Soul from 2018. In the chapter, I focus mostly on Virginia Willis's 2015 book called Lighten Up, Y'all, as an example of how they formulate that authentic Southern cuisine and kind of contradict these stereotypes of unhealthy foods. The worst ones is the weight loss specific cookbooks. By contrast, they convince readers that their version of healthy eating does result in weight loss, and that's its kind of key thing. This is the very before and after pictures kind of cookbook. The explicit rhetorical purpose is to teach people how to lose weight. Southern Living has a branded book called Slim Down South, Eating Well and Living Healthy in the Land of Biscuits and Bacon, by Carolyn O'Neill. And then Virginia Willis, who I talked about in the chapter before, also has a self-published weight loss cookbook that she calls Fresh Start. That's basically like a Weight Watchers version of some Southern food. And I like to put those two together because it shows, you know, within one author, these two very different approaches to the same kinds of healthy cooking. One without that weight-conscious approach and one with it. And then I spent most of the time in that chapter talking about Skinny Southern, 90 Reinvented Classics Without the Guilt, exclamation point, by Laura Lynn Carter. The final category, these are about restricting particular ingredients and also connected with the relief of symptoms of illness. So these are the diabetes, heart disease, gastrointestinal disorder, IBS and Crohn's kind of cookbooks. There are a zillion of them self-published on Amazon as free cookbooks, but I focused more on the commercially published version. And this would be things like the Southern Comfort Food Diabetes Cookbook, usually written by nutritionists. They tend to do this work. Natasha Newton has a Southern Keto book for as a solution for Crohn's disease. There's another keto cookbook that doesn't specifically mark a health problem, but does say like the keto relieves these symptoms. But I mostly focus on My Pine Wood Kitchen, A Southern Culinary Cure by Mee McCormick from 2020 that mostly focuses on like gut inflammation and probiotic cooking in Southern foodways. But in each book, the recommendations are not for general health in moderation, but very specifically about like relieving these symptoms of disease. So taken together, they demonstrate a rhetoric of Southern authenticity that reverses that assumed expectation that Southern food is by nature or essentially unhealthy by offering a version of the authenticity argument that invites readers to change their habits without compromising their regional identity. They also offer a range of possibilities for how they can define authenticity, how we can define what is healthy, how we can define healthy bodies, and the various pleasures of belonging and the pains of illness. So while especially Willis and McCormick really describe their before states as experiencing a lot of pain physically and emotionally, they all emphasize the pleasure of this after state, like after changing the way they eat, as well as the process of getting there. The tenets of fat and disability studies ask us to be critical of representations of fat as illness in need of a cure, and none of the books in this sample meet that standard, not even a little bit. Certainly none of them express pleasure in living in a fat body. They all present weight as a key measure of health, the only way perhaps to know that one is healthy. And so these support the status quo that underpins fat phobia and constructs fat as a medicalized problem and a moral problem in need of solution. But if there's any practical political resistance in the pleasure taken in these books, I think it's the pleasure that each writer takes in eating flavorful and culturally appropriate foods, even as they restrict or alter their eating habits. They all recognize the value of pleasure as a motivation for change and a key part of a healthy life. And for women especially, taking pleasure in their own sensual experiences, in this case taste, runs counter to messages about appropriate gendered behavior. So I feel like there's a little bit of resistance in there. So the chapter really concludes with some recommendations for how cookbook writers might still accomplish the rhetorical goals they have of authenticity or of making a cookbook that has this kind of material in it without drawing on some of those damaging narratives. So maybe emphasizing that pleasure of community, the pleasure of your own sensual experience without adding in this component of shame. So I'd be happy to talk more about some of those examples later, but that is where I will end. Thanks.
I'm gonna grab a snack.
May I use the bathroom?
We've all been sitting up here for 90 minutes.
It's been a while.
I'm gonna come up so people can hear me there.
Well, I suppose I'll stay.
Gonna sit?
Oh, downstairs. Yeah, so like you go out like towards the cafe, and there's gonna be a staircase. You go down and to the right.
Can I just take
You're
this
welcome.
off, Mark?
Yeah.
Cool. I realize we didn't think about how to take questions from folks on YouTube. So in the spirit of continuing the discussion, what I'm hoping is folks will maybe email me those questions at ajulier, a.julier@chatham.edu. Or post on the YouTube when we get there. And as I said, I see this as kind of a continued conversation. But I'm going to take questions from here, although I do want to say a couple of things. Before Carrie gave her talk, I started writing a question about pleasure for all of us. So I think that's a point. I think. And it's interesting because here I am in this world of food studies and I don't think about it that much, but I do. And so one of the things I think about is the best thing about food studies is that most of us who do this work, refuse to ignore pleasure, refuse to ignore like the way sustaining ourselves is literally, sustenance is joyful, even if it's painful, right? And I think in growing and eating food and in being people who study it, like not just in the acts of consuming, but in the way we study it, Warren Belasco always said to me, like people are jealous of us because we get to write and talk about things that are enjoyable, right? It's much more fun than writing about rocks. And so anyway, and I'm less familiar with this in terms of disability studies, but certainly my own experiences with CRIP activism, pleasure and joy are key things. And I'm sorry Dana's not going to be here to hear this, but I think about how she was talking about humor as a defense, but it's also about claiming space, right? It's, it can be both. And so I was thinking about that in terms of the work that we're all doing and recognizing that kind of back and forth between, something that's problematized or difficult or, like John's description of the shitty food system, right? That we work within. But like my question is like how, thinking about how we do that, like how do we, I really appreciated what Farah said about changes in knowledge making, right, as a form of activism. Like that is in and of itself, an activity that changes the world. And so I guess my question for you guys is how you think about like how pleasure and joy kind of fit into what you're doing. I feel like John's videos of Fiona kind of answer it without him having to, but I also want to give you guys the opportunity to talk about that. And Dana will catch you up.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody wants to jump on that.
I mean, I can just finish your thought about the what the videos don't show is the agony leading up to that, right?
Right.
Of like, is my kid killing herself? What do I do, right? And so that's the opposite of joy. And so I think, we and this kind of follows from Carrie's paper, right? So in some ways, like, nutrition and pleasure are opposite, right? And health and joy are opposite. But in this case, like, they're very much the same, right? The stress balloon, popping as this kid eats on her own, right? And so I think that's the way nutrition should be, right?
Right.
Is we should all have what we need to live happy and healthy lives through food and nutrition, which includes pleasure and commensality and all that stuff. It just doesn't work that way too often, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, my entire book is called Pain and Pleasure. And it kind
I
of...
think I knew that.
Yeah. It kind of started from my own kind of personal questioning of why in certain sort of situations I did not prioritize my own pleasure personally, or I was raised in a conservative evangelical culture where my pleasure was like not important, and maybe something to be skeptical of, and maybe something to even avoid, and perhaps I should choose the most difficult path because that would demonstrate my strength of my faith. And when that no longer was very helpful to me, what is my other option as a human being? So it started with my therapist, and then it also became a question in Southern studies. There's a strong current of criticism against foodways in that Southern study space because it has that kind of celebratory part. And lots of Southern studies scholars are like, what do we have to celebrate? We're the people who perpetuated slavery. Like, why are we being proud of the stuff that we have done? So my main question was, how do I have both? Because I can see that both are present. There's a need for that pleasure because that's the discourse, but then there is a reality of pain that can be engaged with critically, even in pleasure, right? That pleasure and critical thinking don't have to be mutually exclusive. So I was looking for ways and examples that the pain could be looked at directly. We could look at it, we could feel it, we could say it, we could name it, we could even offer apology for it, and also, right, still convince people that what I'm offering will make you happy if I try hard enough. Yeah.
I was like, my transition from a medical sociologist to someone who does food and culture came through a book called The Black Women's Health Book, which, there's this lovely article about black women going to, meetings and trainings about hypertension and diabetes, and one of them saying, I know all of this already. I know all this medical knowledge. It's been shoved at me over and over again. And until you can give me something else to deal with, the racism in our lives, then I'm going to go home and I'm going to cook up a pot of food because that's what brings me pleasure and makes me happy. And that just was like a really transformative moment for me in terms of thinking about, how do we embody and engage in these practices? Like how do I move beyond thinking medically about the world? So yeah, I hear it. Yeah.
I really enjoyed all of your talks too, and thinking about pleasure and eating together is just so important. And I think about some of the previous work that I did when I was volunteering in a refugee community in upstate New York, and they show the new Americans this video, that about eating healthy, and the first things they tell them is that they have to eat kale, and I'm like they already eat spinach and they're aloo palak. Why do they have to eat kale? And so for me, this idea that these new Americans don't eat healthy, but they want to eat in community, but they should be cooking kale. And then even in my conversations, these that sometimes are like interviews. One of the widows is diabetic, right? And so her doctor told her to stop eating white potatoes, and so that she should eat sweet potatoes. So rather than making the sweet potatoes in like an Indian or Pakistani curry, she was just eating boiled sweet potatoes by herself for dinner. And where is the pleasure in eating a boiled potato, first of all, and then eating alone, right? Feeling you can't go and eat with the other Indian immigrants in your community. So I just think that pleasure that's tied to, I think, as Carrie mentioned, to community and eating with, your cultural community, whatever that is, I just think is so important. And I always push back when I hear people say that Southern food is bad food because of the racialized also underpinnings of that. Because so I work at a Catholic Jesuit school, and when this new pope became pope, he had to go on a diet because he was eating too much Italian food. But nobody talks about that rhetoric, right? This was actually in the New York Times, I think we can Google it, and so I'm just thinking about new immigrants as well as, soul food versus Southern food. And of course I follow the Paula Deen controversy carefully as well. And I just think that there's just so much important aspects to unpack. And then you get into the intersection of fat studies and some of the work that Anna Malo's doing. And I'm also starting to look at that too because of the widows that are have been diagnosed as diabetic or are perceived as fat, and what does that even mean? So yeah, just so many important intersections.
Yeah, I was just asking about pleasure, and I used your example of humor.
Oh,
and
okay.
how it's both a defense and
Yeah.
a way of claiming space, and just saying.
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I would say definitely humor. There's the term crip humor that people
that's what
use. I can't tell you how many times I transcribed Dana laughs in my transcripts or the other person laughs. I think a couple people come to mind as folks who could easily go on a podcast and talk about their experiences and get people to see things differently just in telling these hysterical but also cringy stories that they have. Yeah.
Thank you all. I mean, I'm happy to open it up to questions, conversation before we eat lunch.
Or at lunch.
Or at lunch,
yeah. Right. I think, though, if I can read this, it might be too small for me to read. Kind of as a positionality and transition into the afternoon. In a lot of my own work and my thinking, there's a book called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. Critical legal scholar, black legal scholar, Patricia J. Williams writes a series of essays about the relationship between blackness, legal positionality. I mean, it's a beautiful book if you've never read it, but it's another one of those books that I read that moved me. So she starts an essay talking about her godmother having had a stroke and coming to take care of her while she's in hospice, and she talks about talking to her and feeding her and how difficult, right, that was, and the care work of doing that. And how, in fact, she said, I'm just going to read some of it. She would eat what I brought in the hospital with relish. She would reject what she didn't want with a turn of her head. I brought fruit, yogurt, ice cream, vegetable juice. Slowly over time, she stopped swallowing. The mashed potatoes would sit in her mouth like cotton. The pudding would slip to her chin. Eventually, they put a tube into her nose and down her stomach, and I lost even that medium in which to communicate. No longer was there odd but reassuring communion over taste. No longer was there some echo of comfort in being able to nurture one who had nurtured me. The increment of decay was like a little newborn death. With the tube, she stared up at me with imploring eyes, and I tried to guess what she would like. I read to her aimlessly and in desperation. We entertained each other with the strange, embarrassed flickering of our eyes. I told her stories to fill the emptiness. I told her stories about who I'd become, about how I had grown up, to know all about exchange systems and theories of contract and monetary fictions. I spun tales about blue sky laws, and promissory estoppel, the wispy feathered complexity of undue influence and dark-hearted theories of unconscionability. I told her about market norms and gift economy and the thin riser's edge of the bartering ethic. Once upon a time, I rambled. Some neighbors included me in their circle of barter. They were in the habit of exchanging eggs and driving lessons, hand-knit sweaters and computer programming, plumbing, and calligraphy. I accepted the generosity of their inclusion with gratitude. At first, I felt like as a lawyer I was worthless, that I had no barterable skills and nothing to contribute. What I came to realize, however, was that my value to the group was not calculated by the physical things I brought to it. These people included me because they wanted me to be part of their circle. They valued my participation apart from the material things I could offer. So I gave of myself to them, and they gave me fruitcakes and dandelion wine and smoked salmon, and in their giving, their goods became provisions. Cradled in this community, whose currency was relational, my stock and myself soared. My value depended on the glorious intangibility, the eloquent invisibility of my just being part of the collective. And in the direct response, I grew spacious and happy and gentle. And so I'll leave you with that in terms of thinking about how we do this collectively. And I hope that we can kind of move into that conversation for the rest of the afternoon. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for everybody on YouTube. And yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
So I believe there's food.